Most of you have heard me speak around town and are familiar with some of the research and writings that I've compiled and been working on for the last several years. A lot of my work goes on a local webpage called pascocemeteries.org. I do a lot of cemetery research, a lot of historical research. Right now I'm working with West Elfers Cemetery and with the Hudson Cemetery, and trying to get those places looking a little better and more presentable and dignified, like the final resting place that they should be. Sometimes that takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort, but in the end it's very rewarding when the families can stand back and look at what they've accomplished. But today I want to talk about my new book. It's called Images of America Hudson. A few years back, some of you may remember, there was one that was published on Newport Richey. I believe the museum was involved with that. So when I contacted Arcadia about doing a book about Hudson, they almost, bent over backwards because they were looking for another book to be done in this area. And in fact, I believe there was one that just recently came out maybe in January for Zephyr Hills. So there are some new series coming out. Check their webpage. If you're not interested in any of the local books, check on books from where your hometown is, because they have right now over 6,500 titles in the United States. So definitely give them a check. Another project I want to mention real quick, I'm working with Starkey Ranch. They're having a Ranchers Roundup next Saturday. It's not open to the public yet. Right now it's open to ranching and pioneer ranching families in Pasco County. But they are also doing a living legacy project. They're trying to collect stories and histories on these ranching families in Pasco County. That's actually going to be debuted next Saturday, and it's going to be on a web page called Scenic, which is part of Starkey's nonprofit that they have out at their ranch. So look forward to that being launched, and it's something I've been kind of helping and assisting them with, which we hope will be a pretty good success, since a lot of the ranches in Pasco County are no more. And also, Memorial Day, May 31st, 11 a.m., we are having a Memorial Day service out at West Elfers, and we are having a flagpole dedication. Local Knights of Columbus dedicated and donated a flagpole out at the cemetery. The cemetery is county-owned, so we had to work with Pasco County in permitting and getting the flagpole installed. But after a couple years of nitpicking back and forth with the county, it's finally done, it's in, and we're going to be having our dedication service out there on May 31st at 11 a.m. So if you can come out, come on out. But I wanted to share with you today some of the images in the book. There are over 200, or about 200 images in the book, including there are some letters and documents that I included in the book, several newspaper articles which highlight and tell some of the history of Hudson. But I wanted to go over some of the photos that are in the book today. As we all know, Hudson was named for Isaac Washington Hudson's family, who settled there in 1878. Now, while Isaac Hudson wasn't the first settler in Hudson, their family is the namesake family for which the town was named for, and they are credited with a lot of the improvements. For example, platting the town site, establishing the post office. Some of Isaac's children were involved in the local churches, and not just one denomination either. They were involved in both the Methodist and Baptist churches in Hudson. In fact, during my research, I recently found a deed where Mary Hudson deeded the property for Hudson's First Methodist Church, which was on Hudson Avenue. So they were involved in more than just establishing the community. This photo is a photo that I acquired from a descendant of J.B. Hudson. We believe that this is an early photo of Isaac Washington, about age 25 or 30. And it's a little difficult to tell here, but Isaac Hudson has a distinct ridge over his nose. And when comparing that with some of the other photographs, you can see that distinct ridge that's over his nose. Something else too, we have to understand that this is an early tintype photograph. And a lot of times those images were reversed. They were the opposite of what they really were in real life. So that image has not been reversed. That is how it appears on the tintype. And I did mess around with it a little bit and did do some reversing and stuff like that. Isaac married Amanda Cobb, and during my research I discovered that Amanda's sister married to Isaac's brother. So there was a connection between their brothers and sisters in that marriage. The Isaac family, when they settled here in Hudson, like I said, in the late 1870s, 1878, they built a coastal home. And according to some of the interviews and early writings with some of the Hudson family, they talk about settling near a big spring. They settled back off the coast a little ways, and I've got some aerials and stuff that we'll show here in a few minutes, which I'll show where some of the stuff in the photographs are. The home, they started construction on the home in 1878. It was not completed until 1880. During construction of their home, some of the writings say that they lived in 2 temporary structures that were built during the construction of this home. Those houses were eventually converted into storage houses after they completed construction of this home. And you can imagine a family of 11 or 12 living in a small storage type shed. Like I said, they did have a large family. This is another photo that came from some of J.B. Hudson's family members. This actually shows several of Isaac and Amanda's children. We have Wiley Hudson in the middle, Alfred Hudson standing over at the right side, Doxy Hudson's holding the fan, and we believe that these are either wives to these guys or daughters that we haven't yet identified. Not everybody in the photo has been identified yet, but we have been able to identify several of them. We believe this was one of the youngest Hudson family members. I believe his name was Thomas, if I'm not mistaken. But again, I've been hoping that some of the Hudson family can help us further identify these photos. This photo, we believe, was taken in the late 1880s, obviously after the family had moved here. And something else, too, while Isaac Hudson was settling over on the coast, if we look at a lot of the homestead records for his children, they were settling inland near Hicks Road. In fact, most of them settled and homesteaded 160-acre tracts out along Hicks Road. After they acquired the deeds to those, then they moved over to the coastal areas and lived near where their parents were living. But a lot of early Hudson settlement did occur inland. Now, like I said, Isaac Washington Hudson and his family were not the first to settle in Hudson. This is an early photograph of Charles William Malachi Lang and his wife Mary Jane Boyette Lang. Before Hudson was platted in 1883-84, the area just north of Hudson, between Hudson and Aripeka, along Old Dixie Highway, was referred to as the Lang Settlement. And it was named after the Lang family who settled there just after the Civil War. I don't think they were here in 1870 census, sometime between 1870 and 1872. And there were some other families here about that same time period. Now this photo, unfortunately, was not good enough to go in the book for quality reasons. It's a photocopy, but this photo was shared to me by the Lang family and is reportedly the Lang homestead, which was just north of today's Hudson town site. You can see again, it's just a small cracker house. I mean, this was the typical cracker-style house in Florida at the time period. Just west of the Lang family, and again, I'll show you some of the aerial photographs and orient where some of this stuff is. Just west of the Lang family at the head of Philman's Bayou and Philman's Creek settled Martin D. Philman and the James Arnold family. This photograph here came out of a French book called, what is the name of the book?
A Frenchman in Florida, I think.
I believe that's the translation, but
Yeah.
it's the translated version is Frenchman in Florida. It's a book that was published in, I believe, 1890. It tells of a story of a gentleman that came here from France. He acquired some property on tax deed, and he basically went out and met the people in the area. He does have several sketches throughout the book. This is a sketch that was in the book, and it's referred to as the James Arnold Homestead. James Arnold is the one holding the axe. James Arnold worked at a sawmill that was just north of Hudson into Hernando County up near Weeki Wachee. It was called the Weeki Wachee Sawmill. Martin D. Philman, standing here, he was more of a hunter and trapper. He worked from the land. You can see that they've got construction of some other homes or other structures in the back. But this structure basically was situated near the head of Philman's Bayou, where the creek starts, and where SunWest Harbortown development, which was just recently approved, will be constructed in the near future. So this area is slated for development. This is the head of Philman's Bayou. Philman's cabin was in this area. He owned 40 acres at the head of the creek, which is on the west side of Old Dixie Highway. The creek empties out into the Gulf. The Lang family lived on the west side of Old Dixie. This is US 19 as it is today. This is Denton Avenue across here. And this road stretching north is Old Dixie Highway, where it empties into Arapahoe Road. A lot of this area was pristine. A lot of the early settlers hunted and fished in this area. In fact, the Littell family, after they moved to Arapahoe, had a boat that was called Queen of the Philman. Okay, so there's some indication that they used this creek possibly to dock early on or to send fishing vessels out. But, you know, again, this is the area that was first settled along the coast even before the Hudson family arrived. Today, that area is part of the SunWest mines. You can see the mining activity that's occurred. This small lake that's right here is where the mine started. Okay, back between 1950 and 1957. This is a 1952 aerial. So you get an idea, since the 1950s, how much has gone on in the way of mining activities up there. Now, this section right here along US 19 is Grace Memorial Gardens. It was back in this area that the Frierson family lived. This is actually referred to as Frierson Scrub, right in around here. Even some of the mining activities have stretched to the east side of Old Dixie Highway. But everything from the north of Sea Pines along Old Dixie Highway all the way to Arapahoe Road is what has been slated for development in SunWest Harbortown. They're going to dredge Philman's Bayou. They're going to take the turn of the creek out. They plan on going straight out in the dredging operation. So they're going to cut basically right through this section of land right here. Now there is an area down here that was platted earlier on, I believe, as a, believe it or not, a trailer park. I mentioned a few minutes ago the Frierson family that settled up in that area. This is an early photograph, charcoal sketch actually of William Graham Frierson. They again lived in the Lang settlement. They were neighbors to the Langs, the Philmans, the Arnolds, these early families. There was an early schoolhouse up there called the Lang Schoolhouse. Some of the earliest school board records we have from 1877 show that the Lang Schoolhouse was in operation with William Graham Frierson serving as one of the early trustees. In 1884, now this is kind of where Hudson gets its start. I believe it was May, or I'm sorry, 1882, May 16th, 1882, John William Hudson established a post office in Hudson. This is John William and his wife, Sarah Jane Fortner, and their 2 children. This is an early, this is the actual post office application that, if you look down at the bottom, is signed by John William Hudson. It was approved, I believe, May 12th or May 16th, 1882. Take note that the office was originally applied for under Hudson Landing, or Hudson's Landing. And there's been some speculation as to why the name was shortened from Hudson Landing to just Hudson. You can see Landing was crossed out. And I was talking with Jeff Miller about it earlier. Some of the early post office applications, when they had a 2-word name, post office did not like to see a post office that had 2 words in its name. So we believe that it may have been shortened because of the 2 words, and as a result they took Landing off. They also did not like these names to resemble any similar post office names anywhere else because of the confusion that it would add of sending mail to somewhere else. So again, there's some speculation as to why it was changed or why it was shortened. This post office, according to the application, was located on the east side of present-day Old Dixie Highway. John William Hudson and some of the Hudson children, Isaac's children, owned 40-acre tracts down in what is today's Hudson. And again, I'll show you where these locations are on the aerials and on plat maps. Shortly after, within 2 years after the post office being established, a lot of people think that a town is established before the post office, but in the case of Hudson, it was the opposite. The post office was established first, and then within a year or two, Isaac Washington Hudson hired survey crews and had the majority of his 200-plus acres platted into a town site. This photo comes again from descendants of the J.B. Hudson family. We believe this is an early photograph of Hudson Spring, which, if this is Hudson Spring, would be one of the earliest photographs of Hudson to date. And we're going to zoom in a little bit on the activities in the photograph, but you can see at the center there's some guys standing with a tripod and some equipment, and I believe the museum has some similar equipment to this, if I'm not mistaken. You've got a guy here that's holding a rifle. Okay, these guys out here in this thick wooded area, it was often, there were a lot of animals, bears, panthers. This time period there weren't Indians, but prior to the Seminole Indian Wars they had Indians to worry about as well. But typically they had somebody that would stand guard or serve as a camp cook. We've got 2 other guys standing over here with what appeared to be ranging rods. Now the ranging rods, these guys would go out in the field and hold these rods that would be sighted into the surveying equipment. And that's how they would lay out the lines for the town site. We believe that these are Hudson family members. Believe it to be John William Hudson and Joseph Bird Hudson. Now, in some of the earlier writings and interviews with the Hudson family, they talk about a boat that they acquired from a gentleman in Bayport by the name of Mr. Hall. The writings indicate that Isaac Hudson traded Mr. Hall a couple of oxen for the boat. The boat was used to take goods back and forth between here and Cedar Key. So this boat served to get the early provisions and food items into Hudson. And this came right up very close to where their house was. Less than a mile from their house.
What do you think this scene is, actually?
Again, I believe this scene is of Hudson Spring and the survey crews that are platting the town site out in between 1883 and 1884. which is when Hudson was first surveyed. The photo was actually titled, there was some writing across the bottom of the photo. And I don't want to misquote it here. Got it in my book. The photo is actually titled on the bottom, Spring space or dash boat fishing at home. Okay? It appears whoever's standing on the bow may be holding some type of fish. But again, fishing doesn't go with the survey crews that are in the back. And I don't believe it's photographic equipment that's on the tripod because of these guys with these ranging rods over here. And actually, if we back up, there are a total of 5 tents that are pitched on the bank of the creek. And I don't know what time of year this was, but it looks to be pretty hot. I mean, they've got canopies over the tops of the tents. If you look at these guys, they're holding an umbrella here in the center. I mean, it looks pretty hot. And you got to realize these early photographs, they were posed. It took several minutes when the negatives or the equipment was exposed. It took several minutes for it for the light to burn the image onto the photographic equipment. So these photographs were often posed, and you can see that the boat is anchored into the spring. And then they've got another boat moored back here. In about 1890, maybe a little bit before, we don't know the exact date and time period that it was established, but after the post office was established and after the town site was platted, after the Hudson family acquired the boat and started bringing merchandise back and forth between here and Cedar Key, they established a mercantile store, a general store that was situated on the banks of the spring. And Joseph Bird Hudson, who we have pictured here, actually in conjunction with his brother, John William Hudson, they ran the general store. It was Hudson's first general store. There's actually a letterhead that I found from March 12th, 1889 from Hudson, Florida. It's J.B. Hudson, dealer in general merchandise and real estate. After they platted the town site, the Hudson family started selling off portions of their property, 200 plus acres that they had. So I assume the real estate that's spoken about in the letterhead is referring to the town site, what they're selling in the town site. So you can, again, this was in conjunction with their brother, and they were bringing these goods back and forth between Cedar Key on their boat. Sometime about 1890, the general store burned down. As the story goes, thieves came in, robbed the store, and they believed that as they were leaving, they set fire to the store. Of course, it was a wooden building. It had decks or docks that extended out to the spring to service the incoming boats or their incoming boats. After the fire, sometime between 1893 and 1894, our resident surveyor, Henry Clay Bush, who's pictured here, and this is an early photograph of Henry Clay Bush that came from the Knowles family, who are related to the Friersons and are related to the Bush family. Henry Clay Bush surveyed an addition to the town site of Hudson. So in about 1894, they expanded the town site. Prior to 1894, the town site really did not extend past present-day Old Dixie Highway. Pictured with Henry Clay Bush is his wife, Lula Isabella Frierson. And on their lap is Maud Eva Bush, is their married name. Her married name, she married to Homer C. Henderson. Okay, so this is Homer Henderson's wife. Now, the Henderson family operated a drugstore here in Newport Richey. This photograph, we believe, dates to about 1887. And the reason I say that is because Henry Bush, after he arrived in Hudson around 1884, he had a homestead that was situated out near Kitten Trail and Hicks Road. And the house appears to be fairly new in construction, which would be in compliance with him building a new home for homesteading, for the requirements homestead. We believe the gentleman that's back here in the back on the wagon is Lula's brother, John Taylor Frierson. There are no photographs that we know of John Taylor Frierson. Henry Clay Bush didn't have any other family members here other than by marriage, so we couldn't really determine who else it may be in the photograph. And if you take note, and of course it wasn't uncommon to see this, there's a chair in the back of the wagon.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? Don't know if it's a chair for somebody to ride or if they were moving furniture to the house.
I must thought it was a bed.
No, it's a chair. I've blown these photos up and looked at them a half a dozen different ways. Not only was Henry Clay Bush a surveyor, but he also served as the town notary public. Henry Clay Bush performed many of the early marriages in Hudson and also executed a lot of the early deeds. You can see this seal, which was his seal, was taken off of one of the land deeds, actually from the Knowles family. And the deed dated to turn of the century. So he was, in addition to his homesteaded property out near Hudson Hicks Road and Kitten Trail, Henry Clay Bush also had a town home that was situated in Hudson. It basically served as an office as well. It's work, and a lot of probably his survey work was done out of that office. But again, like I mentioned, in 1894, 1895, Henry Clay Bush, actually 93, 94 I should say, it was filed for record in February of 1895. You can see it here at the bottom. But in 1893, between 93 and 95, Henry Clay Bush surveyed the addition to the town of Hudson. A lot of the earlier writings and books that are out regarding Hudson's history say that he was the surveyor that surveyed Hudson. Hudson was first surveyed between 83 and 84, and Bush didn't arrive until 1884. So I don't believe he was here when the first surveys of Hudson occurred, but there is no question, because his signature is on the survey here at the bottom, that he surveyed the addition to the town. So he was very familiar with the town site. Now this section, this I believe is the basic addition to the town site. You can see that it stretches over to where the cemetery is. Okay, this is where today's Hudson Avenue and US 19 connect, and the Hudson Cemetery being right on the corner. This jog in Hudson Avenue is still there. They've basically not made it so drastic, it's kind of been stretched out a little bit. But you can still see that jog in a lot of the aerial photographs today. So the town site itself hasn't changed all too much since being surveyed. The edge of the map over here is where Old Dixie Highway runs. So this section of the plat map is from Old Dixie Highway to basically 5A Road. This 5A Road runs to the east side of the cemetery. This is Old Dixie Highway and west. Hudson Spring is right here in the middle. The spring runs out the creek and out to the Gulf. The early Hudson Mercantile Store was situated somewhere, we believe, on the north side of the bank of the spring. You can see Hudson Avenue running here. Hudson Avenue is still in the same place. It basically dead ends at the creek where I was telling you, just south of the spring. Now, again, taking into consideration the time period that this map was done, it was filed for record in February 1895. You can see some of the names on some of these properties. On the property here that says M.L. Mosley, they indicated post office. This was the location of the Hudson Post Office in about 1894-95. And we believe that was in Marcus L. Mosley's home, who was the postmaster at the time. You can see some of the Thomas Brady family here. There were some Baileys that owned property in Hudson too. So it's almost as though there's a snapshot in time. Now, Isaac Hudson Sr.'s family's, the house that they built in 1880 was situated right down here. Right in this area. I don't know if it was on this corner or this corner, but it was right in this area. I believe this is Pine Street today. And Harbor Drive would be right here. The house still stands. It's been modified a little bit. Looks a little different than it does from the photograph I showed a few minutes ago. But you can see how close their house was from the spring. And it's almost as though they built a road to the spring from their house. That's what Pine Street is. And in fact, Pine Street continues past the spring, but this section today is no longer, it's been vacated and doesn't exist. So basically it runs up to the spring and then connects to Hudson Avenue. After the fire of the general store, the Hudson General Store in the 1890s, Marcus Mosley, who I just referenced as serving as the postmaster in the mid-1890s, acquired most of the property that was on the north side of Hudson Spring. Now, Hudson Spring in this photograph is back up in this area. The creek runs out and around and then back this way. After Mosley acquired the old Hudson General Store property, he built a new store. It was a general store and hotel. We believe that this building right here in the photograph is Mosley's store and hotel. We believe the hotel was on the upper floor. I want you to take special note of the roof line of this building. There's an addition on it right here. The spring, or the hotel had docks that overlooked the spring. And as you can tell, it was a common place for the fishermen to moor the boats, to anchor their boats. Now this photograph is, I believe, after the turn of the century. Mosley's store was, like I said, built sometime between 1890 and 1895. And it basically stood there. It was remodeled later on, and I'll get into some more of that. The building across from there, now this is basically the end of Hudson Avenue. This is where Hudson Avenue ends. That is the Hudson Drug Store, which was owned by Dr. Posey. Dr. Posey came from South Carolina. He was born, I believe, in 1866. Hudson's first actual town doctor was a doctor by the name of Dr. Guthrie. When Dr. Posey arrived in 1884, now interesting to note, Dr. Guthrie's town home in relation to this was just down the street and out of this photograph. So we're beginning to speculate, although we haven't been able to confirm, but we believe that Posey may have had some early connections with Dr. Guthrie, or may have taken over the patients of Dr. Guthrie. But the drugstore and doctor's office, the drugstore portion of it was first ran by a Dr. Goshern, who is related to the Dayton family over in Dade City. Dr. Goshern and Dr. Posey ran the doctor's office and drugstore out of the same building sometime around 1905, between 1900 and 1905, it appears in looking at some of the census records that Dr. Goshern enlisted and joined the Army. And at that point in time, Dr. Posey ran the office by himself. Now, Dr. Posey, for many years, was the only town doctor. In 1908, when the 5A sawmills were established, he became the town doctor for 5A. Dr. Posey was trained in surgical. He had surgical skills. So you can imagine that his practices at the 5A sawmill operation, which was extremely dangerous at the time period, were highly needed. In 1909, Dr. Posey was arrested. He was, the stories I've been told is that he was arrested by Hudson's only town constable, who was Alfred Hudson. Alfred Hudson was the brother to Isaac Washington Jr., and they were both sons of Isaac Washington Hudson Sr. But Isaac Jr. was a sheriff. And at that time, it's reported that Alfred Hudson was the constable in Hudson. And basically, Alfred Hudson arrested Dr. Posey. Posey got into an altercation with a gentleman in town who was trying to sell a piece of property that had a well on it. And the well was contaminated, according to Dr. Posey. It was contaminated with typhoid fever. Dr. Posey got into an altercation with the man over the well and over the sale of the property. I mean, ultimately, you got to realize Dr. Posey's the one that's going to be caring for the sick people. But they got into a physical altercation, and I don't know what words were exchanged. I don't know how the event unfolded, but Posey was eventually arrested with, the charges were assault with intent to kill. Posey was sent to prison up in Ocala. Okay? And he also went to prison up in the Panhandle. He was in 2 different prisons at the time period. Now, interesting to note, in 1911, while he was in prison, Dr. Posey received a license to practice medicine and served as the prison doctor. At that point in time, he had some communications with some of Hudson's residents, and he was known to mail medication to some of the residents in Hudson from jail. Got a couple of his letters that talk about medication being received and things of that nature. After he got out of jail, he went back to Georgia for a short time period, and then he came back to Hudson and got another license to practice. Apparently, from what I can determine in records, I don't know if he had to renew licensing, but he had several different medical licensing throughout his time period. I think his first license in Hudson was issued in 1888, if I'm not mistaken on the date. So you can see it's obviously a different time period back then. Just south of Mosley's Hotel and just north of Dr. Posey's office. Posey's office would be situated just outside this photograph, and the hotel would be on the right side, was basically Hudson Spring. Out of the back of Mosley's Hotel, the residents or guests could go out, they could get a canoe, they could go fishing, they could go out the creek. And I want to note in this photograph, obscured just behind the trees, is an island. That island is called, the official name is Cotton Island, but local residents knew it as Bathhouse Island. There were bathhouses that were built on the island where people could boat out and picnic on the island for the afternoon. It's also been reported that the local spongers and fishermen on their way in would stop at the bathhouses and clean up before coming in town to see the women.
Well, where would they get their fresh water from, Jim?
I don't know. I don't know.
Take
I don't know.
baths and salt water?
Don't know. That is a good question. They may have very, yeah, you gotta realize too that while the current coming into the creek was salt water, there is fresh water flowing out the creek from the spring. So, now I will admit that the salt content of this water today is a lot higher than it was back then. In fact, in this photograph, you can see the spring bubbling in this photograph.
A water plant at that point, maybe they had cisterns.
They could have. I know a lot of the fishermen carried water with them because spending days out on the water, they had to have food and water. So may have been something left over from, I don't know. They may have had a cistern out there. Very well may have. They built bathhouses. It wouldn't surprise me that they put a cistern out there. But I know that the people that picnicked and went out there, guests from the hotel and stuff like that, they bathed. It was like a beach, I guess, an early beach. And I want to make another point here real quick. This is not a dock. When I first saw this photograph, and there are a couple different...
They're hanging their nets there.
Yes, this is the early net spreads. These are believed to be some of the original or earlier net spreads that the local fishermen used. And if you look real close, and it's kind of hard to tell in this photograph, there are nets hanging on those spreads. Mm-hmm. And if you look just above the net spread, there are some boys back here cane pole fishing. Okay? While the adults are in the creek on the canoe. And another note of interest is there's another boat that appears to be sunk just beyond there. And one more thing. The boards in the tree where they jumped out, swam. This was a local swimming point too, not just out at the bathhouses. So they did swim in the spring as well.
It was pretty deep there.
Oh yeah. Deep enough to swim. Now this photograph from the spring, this is an actual early photograph of Salem Hatcher. This is an actual houseboat is what this is, or what I've been told it is. It's not a fishing vessel, it was a houseboat. But a note of interest behind here is the building that's in the back. Remember earlier I had you guys note the roof line that was on Mosley's building? Look at the roof line here. It's the same basic roof line that was in the other photograph. Sometime in about the 1920s, Mosley served as the postmaster in Hudson for a while. His wife served as a postmaster in Hudson for a while. When the 5A and Arepica sawmill started, Mosley got a job as a real estate agent for the 5A sawmills. So after the 5A sawmills closed and they moved their operations to Tampa, Mosley and his family moved to Tampa. And in about between the 19-teens and 1920s, the old hotel fell into disrepair. It was not used anymore for a period of time. You can note here that it's missing some windows. A window here is broken out. So this photograph shows the old hotel when it was in a state of disrepair. And before it was remodeled. It was remodeled. And I also want to note here that this hotel was built up off the ground and that the water line was pretty close. And I'm going to show you some other pictures here in a few minutes of what's happened to that water line. This is the same hotel after it was remodeled, believe it or not. Mosley sold the hotel, or the old hotel, and most of the outlying property. He owned a majority of the outlying property that was around the north side of the spring. Sometime in the early to mid 1920s, Mosley sold the property to a Canadian doctor by the name of Dr. C.J. Edgar. Dr. Edgar is the one who renovated the hotel. There are several newspaper articles about the renovation, about the grand opening that occurred. Notice that they put in a seawall. Okay? I believe that this section of the hotel was the original section, and what was happened is they added on to the original section of the hotel. This may in fact be the same houseboat that's in the previous photograph. Okay? And this did also come from the Hatcher family. When they remodeled the hotel, they put in this seawall and they backfilled the marshy grass area that was along the edge here, and essentially reduced some of the size of around the spring and along the creek. The hotel was there until January of 1943 when it caught fire and burnt to the ground. In later years, the hotel was operated up until the 1940s by a gentleman by the name of Jimmy Glass and his father. And the Glass family actually lived in another house that was over on Hudson Avenue, not very far from the hotel, that also served as an early boarding house in Hudson that was owned by Reverend Joseph Smith, who was also a postmaster and helped to establish Newport Richey's First Baptist Church. He was involved with that.
Does the seawall still exist?
Yes, sections of that seawall still do exist. It is in disrepair, and in fact, I was thinking the other day of how it needs to be restored somehow, because it's really, I mean, I know it's just a seawall, but that seawall is a very historic part of the community. The events and stuff that took place here, the fishing and sponging that were brought into this location, I mean, it'd be a shame to see it replaced with something contemporary. The seawall is actually constructed of natural rock and limestone that were collected, I guess, from the area. It had to be quite a task to build that seawall. In addition to the remodeling and the seawall, the doctor added electric and running water to the hotel. The hotel was actually one of the first places in Hudson that had running water. And it was from that location that the Glass family later, in conjunction with some of the Hatcher family, established the Hudson Waterworks. The well that was on this site early on was the water that was sold to Hudson's residents, and which later evolved into the Hudson Waterworks. And the history itself, the history of the water in the community. And Hudson does still provide its own water. It's not on county water. They have their own waterworks.
Do they use the springs?
No.
Okay.
They have tanks that they basically use now. This is a photograph of the front side of the hotel. Again, the spring would be just out of view here. I'm not quite sure when this photo was taken, obviously after the hotel was remodeled, so after 1926. But this very well may show the grand opening dinner that occurred at the hotel and on the hotel grounds. There are some newspaper articles that do reference the dinner and how it was a delightful day. Not only did the residents spend the day at the hotel, but they spent the day on the hotel grounds and on the creek and in the spring. So, you know, this, after it was remodeled, I guess I should note, it became called the Gulf Springs Lodge. And interesting to note that in the 1940s, there was a local attorney who was working with some of the residents, and he sent a letter to the Postmaster General trying to have the Hudson Post Office name changed to Gulf Springs. saying that it better represented the area because I guess of the springs and the access to the Gulf. Just west of the hotel. Now this is on the opposite side of the spring from where the other fish nets we just saw were located. You can still see Cotton Island in the distance. The local fishermen built another set of net spreads, and there was another set that were just back down the creek a little bit here. They would bring their nets in on the skiffs here. You can see the walking platforms that were built around the edge of these. They would hang the nets there not only to dry, but they would hang them there to mend them. You got to realize that back then nets were not synthetic. I mean, they were synthetic in the respect that they were all handmade. They weren't made by a machine like they are now of nylon. They were all made with very fine, delicate thread. And I've seen a couple of the original fishing nets, and I do not know how that was an art in itself, was making and repairing those fishing nets. And really that is an art that is now lost and is dying. There are not too many people that still make fishing nets by hand, especially in this area.
Ken Field was the photographer, I believe.
Yes, that was actually an early postcard. Here you can see the wall, the seawall that extends from the spring and from the hotel. The fishing nets that we just saw in the photograph before back over here. In between those nets and the hotel, the resident fishermen built a local fish house. Now this was owned by several different families. The Jack Knowles owned it for a while. The Yeomans family owned it for a while. Trying to think, there was one other family. I believe the Sibleys may have operated out of there for a while. But you can see in this photograph all the boats that were anchored around the spring. This was the center of town. Here's another view of the same fish house. Notice the boats are much larger. This vessel right here was brought in at high tide. Okay, when the tide went down, the boat was left sitting up here on the land. Now this is how they cleaned these boats early on. Okay. This boat was actually owned by Jack Knowles and the Knowles family. It was called the Mary Ann. And I do have several other names of the boats in here. I believe this boat right here is the Spirit of Hudson, which was owned by the Lissick family. I've been told that that boat is in the bottom of the spring.
Yeah, would it be all right if we just stop for just a minute or two?
Yes, go ahead. So, again, you can see that the spring was definitely used. The net spreads that we looked at a few minutes ago are back actually in behind here. Can't really see them, but I guess as time went on, the boats got bigger. And now in 1903, and referring back to our resident surveyor, Henry Clay Bush, Hudson received the railroad. About 1903. Henry Clay Bush, the resident surveyor, was responsible for surveying a lot of the railroad lines for the railroad companies. This photograph, and give you a relation as to where we've been talking about, the hotel in this photograph is just to the left and out of sight here. Right behind this tree, you can see the roof line, is the old Hudson train depot. There are no known photographs of the Hudson train depot that exist. As many train photos and stuff as there are out there, I would like to believe that there is one, but I have never seen one. And this photograph actually came from Henry Clay Bush's daughter, Eva Henderson. It came out of their collection. And one thing I want to note, there have been some previous, this picture's been out a couple times. I acquired a different copy than had been previously scanned And one thing I noticed when blowing this up, this train that's parked here, if you look at the second car, which is basically where they carried the wood to burn in the locomotive, barely legible on the side of the car, it says Aripeka Sawmill. Okay? So this is actually an early train from the Aripeka Sawmill operation. And the train, or the railroad tracks that came into Hudson, were essentially built for the sawmill operation. The railroad was originally called the Brooksville-Hudson Railroad, and it connected Hudson and Brooksville. And then after that line, there was another line built that connected Hudson with 5A. So it was a spur line off of here that went to 5A. And you can see there's a few guys in here working. Photo is a little dark. But yeah, it's an Aripeka Sawmills locomotive.
Jeff,
Yes.
do you believe that the train itself traveled what was known as the old salt road, went the same followed close to the
It's probably, if not, it's pretty close. I don't know if it's the exact same route, and I've been trying to determine where that road cut across the county. What he asked is if I thought the old railroad track followed the old Salt Springs Road. Back during the Civil War, there was a salt works near Salt Springs, which is near Gulfview Square Mall, and there was a road that stretched from the salt works up towards Brooksville. And it was the means of travel between Brooksville and Salt Works. But I have not been able to determine exactly where that road travels, and would really like to, because I believe it may have been along that road that the Union troops marched when they raided on Brooksville in 1863. And if we can find where that road is, we may be able to find some remnants and relics of the past that say, yes, this is where the troops marched, which is a whole new chapter in Pasco County's history, if we can figure out where it's at, you know. To give you an idea, now this is a 1952 aerial. This is the old railroad line through Hudson. It stretched up. This is Old Dixie Highway through the center. This is Hudson Avenue. The old railroad line ran along what is now known as Stevens Drive. If you know where Hudson Bowl, the bowling alley, is on US 19, it was basically right in that area where the railroad track ran. It's a dirt road. Somebody told me, and I don't know if it's urban legends or not, but somebody told me when they built Stevens Drive that they did not even remove the timbers from the railroad track, that the timbers were still left in the road when it's a lime rock road. So basically, and you got to realize too, these early roads, they didn't have anything under them, they were sand traps. So they may have left those in there
For stabilization.
for stabilization, I don't know. And again, I don't know if it's an urban myth or not. But the railroad track, when it came into town, this area right in here is about where the Hudson Depot sat. The hotel sat right in here along the edge of the creek. A fish house that we've been looking at is back in here. The railroad extended out. As it stretched through town, there were 3 locations that the railroad or the train would stop while it was in town. The first was the depot. The second was one of the warehouses that was on the creek. And then the last was at the very end of the line, which was another set of warehouses that were owned by the Littell family. Corwin Pearl Littell owned the fish houses that were out here on the creek. And again, you can see the creek flows out and around and out to the Gulf. And then there's some tidal creeks and stuff up and through here.
Now that creek is what comes out at Hudson Beach?
No. This is, what comes out at Hudson Beach, I believe, is some of these tidal creeks that they dredged.
Wouldn't that be out near the marina?
Well,
Closer to the marina?
I'm going to tell you, and we're going to look at a modern day aerial. you cannot recognize what any of this is today. It just does not look anything like it used to. So trying to figure out where things are is a little difficult.
Overlay,
I'm sorry?
can you overlay using Dixie Highway?
Yeah, we might be able to. I haven't tried to do any overlaying yet,
Yeah,
but
with transparencies maybe or something like that?
yeah.
Because Dixie Highway seems to be the constant.
Yes, and actually, a little bit of history I wanted to tell folks about Dixie Highway, and I didn't mention it earlier. I've got some research in conjunction with Salt Springs that we just talked about that kind of indicates that sections of Old Dixie Highway was once part of a military road that dates back to the Second Seminole Indian War. Parts of the road appear to have been constructed as early as 1837 by a Colonel William Davenport and a detachment of troops that he marched down along the coast. Now, oddly enough, the road that William Davenport built, according to maps, stretches from the Chassahowiska River all the way down to the Anclote River, and it crosses every river and creek in between. And I don't know any other road on the coast that crosses or comes close to intersecting all those rivers other than Old Dixie Highway. Maybe parts of Old Post Road.
Salt was so important.
Oh, absolutely.
So, I mean, this section, the Old Dixie Highway is a very, very historic road, or sections of it are very historic. The warehouse at the end of the railroad line, this is the warehouse that was owned by Corwin Pearl Littell, or C.P. Littell. And again, this is the end of the railroad line. You can see that the tracks out here were through the marsh grass. They were built up on trestles as basically a railroad bridge. And if we back up to that aerial photograph, all out and through here it was in the marsh grass. And even through sections here and sections up in here, these are all tidal influenced. And I'll tell you what, that is still visible on aerial maps today. You can find the old railroad track or railroad bed today. But Corwin Pearl Littell, he built he called it a warehouse. It was built at the end of the railroad line. And you got to realize that this is pretty close to the mouth of the creek where it empties into the Gulf. By strategically building this where he built it, the boats no longer had to navigate up the creek to the spring. They could dump their loads off of fish here or whatever it was that they wanted to export out on the railroad and didn't have to bring those boats up the creek. And at certain times, I imagine that the creek was difficult to navigate. And it's probably interesting to note that as early as March of 1899, the resident fishermen attempted to get Hudson Creek dredged by the Army Corps of Engineers. The earliest record I have is something from Congress that indicates a Senate bill in March of 1899 that allocates the survey of the coast at the creek for dredging purposes. The reason they did not dredge it is because there was a very thick, large bed of lime rock and stone that they had to dredge through. And as a result, they dredged Tarpon Springs instead, or the Anclote River down at Tarpon Springs. And as a result, Tarpon Springs prospered in their sponging industry. A lot of the resident spongers in Hudson would take their catches to Tarpon because it was easier to navigate the creek after it was dredged. So Hudson lost a lot of fishing industry and business due to the non-dredging of the creek. Here is another view from the creek of the warehouses. Eventually there were two other warehouses built on either side. The middle one is the original warehouse that C.P. Littell built. There were no turnarounds at the end. That's why in this photo you see that the train backed in to the warehouse. So when it came into town, it had to back into town.
How far away did it have to back? Was there some kind of turnaround or something?
Well, eventually, and I'm referring back to this, eventually when they built the spur line that went down to 5A, the trains could back up on that spur line or could at least navigate a little bit. There may have been a turnaround in the spur when that was added. But prior to the spur being added, unless there was a turnaround up near Loyce, I just wonder if they didn't back in from Brooksville. I think that's what they did too. It was a long backwards ride, but probably a slow one too. And
Still faster than buckboard.
not only did that train move goods and services and fish and turpentine and things like that, it moved the early mill workers to the sawmill from Brooksville. A lot of the early sawmill workers for 5A lived in Brooksville while the mill was being developed early on. Interesting to note, they are loading stuff onto the train right here. There is a barrel that's on a dolly, and I have identified C.P. Littell and his son standing right here on the dock, the owner of the fish house.
Is that whiskey?
Huh?
Was that barrel full of whiskey?
It could have been salted fish, it could have been turpentine, could have been whiskey, you never know back then. C.P. Littell also owned a general store in Hudson that was built sometime after the turn of the century, and it was situated a little bit west of Mosley's Hotel and Gulf Springs Lodge, as it would become known. This photograph here, notice the sign that's right here, the little sign, not the Puritan shoe sign, but this sign. If we scan this photo to a high resolution and zoom in on that sign, it says Fishing, Hudson, Florida on the sign. C.P. Littell's store, which we believe is in this photograph, again, because this is not a two-story building like Mosley's building, his store was actually called Littell and Sons. That's what I've been able to determine. Not only did he operate the general store, but they did sell fish. He operated a fish company, and we believe that's what the warehouse was used for out on the creek. You can see that they
Little fish.
tarpon. Those are tarpon is what they are.
Commercials have.
Corwin Pearl Littell is standing right here next to the fish here. This is Corwin's father-in-law, William Hankinson Nelson. William Nelson is the one that operated the general store for C.P. Littell. In the 1920s, Corwin Littell ran for House of Representatives, I believe it was, and was elected. And during that time, he had his father-in-law operate the general store. This general store relied a lot on the sawmill at 5A, and when the sawmill at 5A went belly up, so did this store. They had a lot of things that were sold on credit, and when the people left 5A, they did not pay their credit. And as a result, the store went bankrupt and went out. Yes?
Was the tarpon of any commercial value then?
This early on, I don't know, maybe in more recent years, I do have some figures and some correspondence that talk about some of the fish, mullet, mackerel, things of that nature that they would catch for sales. Tarpon was more of a sport thing.
They smoked it too.
Yeah, they did eat it. They, you know,
It was tough.
I think these fish here weren't for sale. They were not just for sport, but for food. Now, interesting to note, this guy here is holding the gaff. You can see the several gaff holes in these fish, where they were gaffed up onto the boat.
And notice there are no women.
Women didn't go out tarpon fishing.
So, and these obviously are these guys' children. We haven't been able to identify all of them, but I think Bartow Littell is the one with the hat overturned. Another local store that we had in town was owned by Homer C. Henderson. who again was the husband of Eva Bush, daughter to Henry Clay Bush. The Friersons, again, the Frierson family are the ones that are in this wagon. This store was located just east of the hotel. It was back in off of the water a little bit from the spring. And I've got another aerial. I'll show you where this store was located.
Where's
No-
the horse's head?
It is actually right here.
Oh,
It's got his head down. They got blinders on the horses.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, there it is. I have to ask you a question. Isn't Eva Henderson the mother of Roscoe?
Yes, yes.
I knew all this.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Melvin?
We're almost done, I promise. I'm long-winded. Notice some of the announcements and stuff that are hanging. And you can see the name of the store, H.C. Henderson. To give you an idea, this store sat over in this area, right in here. It was back off from the spring. The hotel back here, train depot here, Littell warehouses, Littell's store, and then Homer Henderson's store. There was also a couple other stores that were located back in this area on Hudson Avenue. Vivian J. Lewis, or Vivian I. Lewis, was an early store owner. He had a store that was down here along Hudson Avenue. This is a 1957 aerial of when the dredging around Hudson began and the backfilling around Hudson began. You can see all the backfill that's been done in and around here. And I'm going to back up and show you the previous photo again. Take note of this area up here, and then in and along these areas.
Boy, it's changed.
This is the end of the railroad track where there was really nothing. This has been all dredged out. There was a small tidal creek here, and it's all been dredged out, backfilled along both sides. This section, they blocked this creek off when they started dredging, but eventually cleared this back out and cut some drainage canals in there, just to give you an idea
There it is today.
where we're at today.
Big difference.
Yes, Stevens Drive, again, this is where the railroad track ran into town. And this was back out here where the Corwin Pearl Littell warehouse was. This was the end of the railroad track. Hudson Spring is right up in here. The creek, you can see, has obviously been narrowed greatly through the backfilling. An interesting note is Hudson Spring is the location of where Bear Creek empties into the Gulf of Mexico. Back in the 1950s and 60s, my grandfather, who was working on a lot of the roads in this area, did dye testing on a lot of these sinkholes as part of road construction. They did dye testing on Bear Creek and on the sinkhole that is at Bear Creek. And between Bear Creek and Hudson Spring, every hole or sinkhole that's in between, that's in Beacon Woods, every hole that's in between there had dye that came up in it. So there's an
It's an underground.
extravagant cave system underground that connects all of these holes. Now, the area development, and we've talked about how Hudson Spring used to flow at one point in time. A lot of these underground caverns and caves between here and Bear Creek, because of development, have been filled in. And as a result, Hudson Spring essentially no longer flows. It has no flow left to it. Occasionally they claim if we get some strong storms and Bear Creek has a lot of water running through it, that occasionally it will wash stuff out of it, but the flow has been reduced so much that it's saltwater now. There's really no more fresh water in it. It's almost like there may be some salt water down in the bottom of the spring that just barely flows out, but the majority of it's salt water that flows back in to these canals on high tide. And I will tell you that prior to the development of Hudson Avenue and the paving of Hudson Avenue, there were tidal creeks on both sides of Hudson Avenue that when the water came up, those creeks would get water in them. Those creeks are no longer today.
You used to see blue crabs and stuff back up in them.
There are people that report catching blue crabs as far back as up here behind the shopping plaza. Now, I don't know if this far back used to be tidal influence, but if you go look at that area, there's nothing but white beachy sand there. And they used to catch crabs there, some of the kids.
Bear Sink.
Yes.
itself, which is a sink that sets off the creek a little ways. I can remember as a boy going there, and the thing that made it unique was you could actually see the water going down into the ground.
Yeah.
That when the creek itself flowed over, it would flow back into the sink, and the water would go down instead of coming up like a spring. It would actually disappear in. And like you say, it hasn't done that in many, many, many years.
I've got a photo from a couple years ago of Bear Sink, and the water in the sinkhole has become so stagnant that it has duckweed and algae growing on the surface now.
Yeah.
So you can tell that the water has been reduced. I mean, the
So where
flow.
would that Bear Sink be?
It's actually out of this photo, 50 intersection of 52 and Little Road. You know where Plaza of the Oaks is? Basically behind Plaza of the Oaks is where Bear Creek and Bear Sink is.
Just west of Little Road.
Yep. Yep.
And in 1960, we had so much rain that it flooded. 19 went underwater.
Yep.
52 went underwater.
I remember back in the 80s that we had a couple weeks worth of rain and Bear Creek flooded, and there were sections of the swamp over there on Little Road that had knee-deep water in it. You know, and that's something else I don't quite understand about the coastal development up at SunWest Harbor Town, is we're all going to be paying higher insurance rates on our homes when these homes up there get destroyed.
I want to set you straight on some of that stuff.
Go ahead.
I sold all that property about 1958. It was supposed to be Emerald Beach. And
Right.
It took everything, there was 2,000 acres
Right.
that was rented from Arapika all the way down to Hudson. Now you talk to Brenda Knowles and her daddy sold, I
Oh,
think,
yeah.
a 40-acre tract, and they went broke. He had to take it back, but it was all to be developed.
It was
and
to
the
be,
only
right.
thing that is still, if you go up that, there's still Emerald Boulevard there,
Right.
and there's Grace Memorial Gardens.
Yep.
That was part of the thing, and that's all there is. And Stevens Drive, that was named for Red Stevens.
Yep.
And Melvin Fair, Shearer, who owned that land, had that trailer park developed you were talking about.
Yep.
That
Yep.
park developed that for him, put that, because Stevens was, so I know a little bit about the history on that stuff.
Yeah, that's some of the, and some of that's come up in some of the development phases of SunWest Harbor
You
Town.
know Jimmy Hotnut?
I'm sorry?
You know Jimmy Hotnut?
No, I don't think I do.
Well, he's from Dade City, and they owned all that land that Melvin Shearer didn't own.
Okay.
And that was supposed to be developed where Sea Pines is and all, that's supposed to,
Yeah.
Emerald Beach was the name of the subdivision. And you go look at the city county record,
Oh, it's there. I've seen it.
and I got through it with the whole thing, it cost me $900.
This is a photo of Hudson Springs at Centennial Time, which was in 1978. You can see that a lot of the property around it has become privatized. This is part of the Hudson Springs trailer park or mobile home park.
Yeah, that's not too bad.
The mobile homes they've added some, they put some newer mobile homes in there now that are up on stilts if you go down in the area. There used to be a lot of the mobile homes that look like these back in there, but they've improved or tried to improve. This is actually a walkway and a bridge out over the spring that the residents would utilize. And you can see the life preserver on the tree says Hudson Springs.